This is our special interview. You know, the record breaking heat that has been gripping the Pacific Northwest of the United States and Western Canada. These are regions of the West Coast areas of the US and Canada, including cities like Portland, Seattle, and Vancouver, has been making the headlines. And this is quite serious. We're talking about thousands of people being hospitalized, the death toll being in the hundreds. So, definitely so many questions. What's causing such an extreme weather event? We have invited Andreas Schmittner, professor of college and earth, ocean, and atmospheric sciences at Oregon State University, to speak on this issue. Hi, Professor. Thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, Catherine. Good to be with you.
Yes, so we hear that the temperatures are basically record breaking. So can you give us a breakdown? How hot are we talking about?
Well, here in Corvallis, where I live, we had temperatures of about 111 degrees Fahrenheit. So that's 44 degrees Celsius. So that's really unusual. You know, this is something like that would typically occur in the Death Valley Desert. So
Yes.
it was really, really hot.
And so right now, normally, what are we looking at? Like, not this year, but normally in the past, around this time of year, what kind of temperatures would we be expecting in your area?
Well, typical temperatures, so the daily high temperature, which is in the late afternoon typically, is around 72 degrees Fahrenheit or about 22 degrees Celsius. So that's the average.
Right. So,
But yeah,
so that's quite a difference. You're talking about a record high of 44 versus the average of 22 degrees.
right. Yeah. Yeah, it has been unusual and unprecedented, really, in terms of this time of year. We do sometimes get temperatures over 100 degrees, so that's about 40 degrees Celsius in August. But I've never experienced anything like it since I've been here. And, the records speak for themselves. So we've never had that warm temperatures that early in the year, in late June.
Yes, and so I'm thinking for the residents in this area, the Pacific Northwest, Western Canada, that they probably weren't expecting things to get this hot this early on. So what kind of danger are the residents facing? Because we've been hearing about so many hospitalizations, plus all the deaths also.
Yes, well, nobody expected something like this, and people were not prepared. You have to realize that typically, because we're close to the ocean, we get the sea breeze in the evening, and that cools things off. That didn't happen during that heat wave, so temperatures stayed high throughout the night, which made things worse. And then, only a fraction of people, maybe 2/3 or so, have air conditioning. I personally have a small air conditioning box that is put in my window, so I had that run for 24 hours when it was like the hottest day, and that kept indoor temperatures, okay for me. But many people do not have air conditioning. And then also, we still have lots of homeless people here from last summer's fires, the wildfires that we had
Ah.
that had burned down lots of homes. And so there's lots of people living in tents, living in trailers, living in RVs that do not have air conditioning, I assume, and they had a hard time, I guess, with that extreme heat.
Right. So, in terms of the normal daily lives of residents being disrupted, I mean, so you just spoke about the homeless population, people being ill prepared for this type of hot weather this early on in the season. So, what has changed? Are people adjusting to this?
Um, I don't know. That's hard to tell. I mean, I made sure that my air conditioning was installed and working because I knew this was coming. But it's hard to tell what people in generally are doing. I think we're still processing what happened.
Right. And, in the news, we've been hearing about experts talk about like a heat dome or dome of high pressure over the Northwest. What does this exactly mean?
Yeah, so this was a weather event that is characterized by high air pressure in the upper levels of the atmosphere. So when you have that high pressure in these upper levels that pushes air down from these upper levels to the surface. And that leads to warming as the air compresses. At the surface, you have higher pressure, and so the air compresses, and that leads to warming. And that caused essentially that warm temperatures. And it also caused, at least here in my region, the wind that typically comes from the ocean, so from the west, it reversed and came from the east, and so we didn't get that cool air in the late afternoon from the ocean.
Yes. So, Professor, let me ask you this then, because I mentioned how, just because it's so hot, I mean, you can't, if you have an air conditioner, I would assume that you would turn it on. But in essence, could this be a vicious cycle? The fact that, because of the heat, people are turning on more air conditioners. And so that might be contributing to, greenhouse gases and global warming that in turn is affecting the weather patterns or the climate?
Yeah, in principle, yes. But I mean, if people turn on air conditionings during a heat wave, this is just a very tiny contribution to the global warming. But in general, fossil fuel use in general, of course, leads to global warming. And global warming has made this heat wave worse, as we know that it makes all heat waves worse in the northern hemisphere or on the globe in general. So heat waves are getting hotter. They are become more frequent, they're longer, and so more hot records are being broken due to global warming. So global warming makes these heat waves worse.
Well, in your opinion, do you think this is a passing kind of phenomenon, like it's a one-off, or that you expect this heat wave to continue, or maybe, taper off and then come back again this season?
Well, this particular heat wave has already passed, so we're back to more normal temperatures here.
Okay.
But in terms of kind of long term, since global warming is expected to continue unless we get our act together and reduce carbon emissions. So as long as global warming will continue, we will have more and more heat waves like this. So they will become more frequent and they will become hotter and longer.
Right. And in this day and age, it seems that it's not just this region, Professor, but in many other parts of the world, we've been hearing about like extremely hot weather or extremely cold weather. Is this something that we're going to have to get used to and something that we're going to have to continue to address in terms of lowering the carbon emissions you just spoke about?
Yes, well, the high temperature extremes are made worse by global warming. Low temperature extremes, so the cold events, they get less frequent because it's getting warmer. But the hot temperature events are often, more impactful because more people die during hot extremes than during cold extremes, so they have higher impacts. And those, yes, as I mentioned, so those are caused in part by global warming. So global warming makes those heat waves worse, and it will continue to do so in the future. And that is one of the important reasons, I think, that we should, as soon as possible, reduce carbon emissions. Because if we keep going on emitting carbon, climate will get warmer. It will get warmer as long as we keep emitting carbon to the atmosphere. We will only stabilize temperatures when we completely reduce carbon emissions to zero. So when we do not emit any carbon at all into the atmosphere, only at that point will we stabilize climate. And at that point also, these heat waves will not continue to get worse.
Well, in theory, that sounds, very good, Professor, to get to that zero. But how realistic is that?
Well, the Paris Agreement already tries to reduce carbon emissions. Of course, reducing all carbon emissions to zero will be difficult. There's no doubt about it. But on the other hand, if we don't do it, we will have a continually warming climate. And, it will continue to warm as long as we emit carbon into the atmosphere. And that will lead to more and more of these heat waves and other impacts. Heat waves are not the only impacts of climate change. There's ocean acidification, for example, in the ocean. We have sea level rise, glaciers melting in the mountains, all kinds of, and for example, here in the Pacific Northwest, particularly the wildfires that have increased recently, that is also a very dramatic and negative impact of global warming.
Yes, indeed. Well, I do want to thank you so much for joining us today and answering our questions on the heat wave that did hit the Pacific Northwest region. Take care, Professor. Thanks for joining us.
You too. My pleasure. Thank you.
All right, that was our special interview. And as a professor indicated, we as human beings need to lower our carbon emissions and get to that, at this point, elusive zero. But of course, as more governments and states and people around the world are jumping on the bandwagon, as they say, to get to that zero net carbon emissions, hopefully we can change what's happening in terms of these extreme heat waves. And as a professor mentioned, wildfires, acidification, and sea level rise as well.